Military personnel of many ethnic backgrounds served with distinction in the Vietnam War. Beginning in 1988, studies began to be done to find out what the problem was. First and foremost, it demonstrated that minority populations seem to have a disproportionate amount of problems coming back from combat. This project involved two parallel studies as it relates to the American Indian Vietnam veterans. They surveyed Vietnam veterans who were on reservations, one in the Southwest and one in the Northern Plains. The participants were interviewed face to face. They were asked about their upbringing, their families, their traditions, what they ate, to try and figure out why there were these disparities, why they were struggling. The key findings in this study, the Matsunaga study, is that exposure to war zone stress and other military danger places veterans at risk for PTSD several decades after military service. So it doesn't mean it happens right away. It can happen anytime, decades later. And in fact, what we find out and we know today is often this burden stays with individuals and families for decades, and it manifests itself late. This information has been available to us for a while, but we're getting more understanding, more in-depth understanding that you didn't necessarily have to have the bullets whizzing by your head or having incoming, but just being in an area where there was stress, depending on what your own resilience is, can have you be affected by PTSD or some mental health challenge. The unique cultural traditions, society, and family experiences of each of the different ethnic groups played an important role in the veterans' homecoming and readjustment after Vietnam. They do not appear to either cause or prevent PTSD, but are a factor in that. So if we look at American Indian veterans' experience before and during the war, and it's a very rich body of information, where you read some of the histories that were derived, and there's a common thread about honor and dignity, about family, about protecting the land, about serving, about selfless service. And you, as you read through all these documents and you look at the veterans' experience before they went to war, you see this thread in Native America, that this was part of the culture. It was a culture of selfless service, and it was a culture of characteristics and character that we all want people to emulate. American Indians described growing up in a supportive tribal community on or off the reservation. They felt secure. They had extended families. They cared for their parents. Their grandparents were more revered as they got older because they had all the wisdom. And you think about where our society's gone today, and there's a lot we could do to emulate those tribal leaders and the information that they gave us a long time ago. As they entered the military, American Indian veterans often joined as a way to obtain opportunities, education, and travel that might not otherwise be available to them on the res. In addition to wanting to serve their country, many wanted to become warriors to protect their families. This is out of the history that they extracted over decades. To uphold the honor of the tribes and to prove themselves as men, military training was a shocking experience with good and bad aspects. For the good, they found discipline and skills and team spirit, an invaluable preparation for both war and later adulthood. On the other hand, many felt torn between traditional, spiritual, and community values and the military emphasis on aggression and sometimes having to kill. Many faced racial prejudice and discrimination, often for the first time and up close when they left the reservation. They felt disillusioned when they or other Indians encountered racial hostility or disrespect. More than 1 in 2 American Indian veterans experienced war-related trauma in Vietnam. The war traumas included being on frequent or prolonged combat missions in enemy territory, encountering ambushes and firefights, being attacked by sappers, snipers, artillery, or rockets, witnessing death and terrible harm to their own or others' bodies. Traumas also included being under fire on helicopters, cargo and reconnaissance aircraft, patrol boats, and cargo trucks, and being on very hazardous duty, such as walking point or being a radio operator, medic, scout, etc. American Indians faced war and trauma quite often and disproportionately because of numbers that I've already mentioned to you, because of their willingness to serve, to volunteer, and take on some of the toughest jobs in our military. Homecoming wasn't the best for any Vietnam veteran, but it was challenging for our American Indians as well. People didn't separate policy from the warrior at that time. And the warriors often were castigated, were looked at disparagingly, because the public didn't understand that all our warriors have done is to do what their nation asked them to do. Today, I'm extremely happy that the public understands, whether you agree with war or not, whether you agree that we should be in Afghanistan or Iraq, that's not the issue. Every one of our young men and women who get sent downrange in harm's way, they are heroes because they did what their government asked them to do. If we have a complaint, it should be against those elected officials, if there's a complaint. But the fact is, it is our men and women who are heroes no matter what. And as I often would say to my colleagues in Congress when I had the opportunity and they'd be arguing about veterans benefits and things, I'd say, you know what you're missing, guys? When I was a young NCO in Special Forces downrange, and I think back to my team in combat, I don't know who was a Republican or a Democrat. It didn't make a difference because you sent us there as Americans, and you guys forget that on the Hill. We're Americans first, okay? All this politics stuff goes to the side. And I've often said, if there's one thing that both parties ought to be able to join hands and sing Kumbaya is taking care of our veterans, because they are the Americans. So we have a number of stories, and I just summarized one. So the young Indian veteran comes home. He says, I was spit on and called a baby killer. This isn't really unique to just the Indians. It was all of us who came home from Vietnam because the public was so mad and upset about 10 years of war that seemed to go no place. And yet, our young men and women came home and did what the country asked them to do. Unfortunately, it took a while before the public realized that we had to separate those things, as I told you. So for many who came home, it was a long journey. And when you think about the trauma, what we call shell shock or battle fatigue then that we now know are mental health problems or PTSD, now add on top of that the harassment that you get when you come home as a warrior, where you're looked at disparagingly. And we compare it today to how every kid coming to an airport gets a hug and a thanks for serving their country. It was a tough time to be a Vietnam veteran. And many of the veterans I see here lived through that and survived. But probably each and every one of them has a story. Each and every one of them struggled. Each and every one of them maybe still struggles. Because if you look in our VA hospitals today, many of my former teammates too, they're still fighting that war in their mind. It hasn't gone away. Just because 50 years have passed, it hasn't gone away. You still have trouble sleeping. You still have trouble getting jobs. The divorce rates are higher. All kinds of social determinants of what we call health are in the wrong place. And kind of life has passed many of those people by because of that. So many veterans are unable to leave behind the trauma of Vietnam and psychologically return home. What neither these veterans nor their families nor even VA counselors and doctors do was that many of these veterans really at the time were suffering from PTSD. Fortunately, now we have a better understanding. About 1 in 3 American Indian veterans who served in countries suffered from full or partial PTSD at the time of the original study. A quarter century or more after the war, more than 2 in 3 American Indian Vietnam veterans suffered from full or partial PTSD sometime in their service and after their service in Vietnam. PTSD also affected the families. American Indian Vietnam veterans reported the most severe problems of any ethnic group, with domestic violence, divorce rates, problems in reassimilating back into society, families who just couldn't figure out how to deal with these folks. And then you take that problem out to the res, where there really isn't a lot of medical support. There's not a lot of psychologists, psychiatrists, or medical care, and you're remotely displaced from places where you really need your care. It even makes it a tougher problem for our brothers and sisters in Native America. Other people, such as spouses, children, family members, friends, or co-workers, often are more aware of the veteran's emotional distress than the veteran themselves, because they see a change. They see that daddy or mom aren't acting like they used to. They're short-tempered. They blow up about some simple things. Some little thing goes wrong and they act out of proportion. It's the family that picks it up and says, this is not the dad I knew. This is not the mom I knew. This is not the sister or brother I knew. But we have a better awareness of that today. The family's view of PTSD may be little things get them very depressed or enraged. He tries to enjoy being with us, but he's never quite there. You hear that over and over. He's here physically, but mentally and emotionally, he's not there. For him, every problem could be a disaster. He's always on the go, doesn't want to talk about anything, but he's always moving. And I never understood why he kept going back to alcohol and drugs from one family member, but now I understand, because the pain in the mind, the challenges, the depression, the flashbacks of all those bad things, you seek a crutch. And it's not the right crutch, but nevertheless, we see a disproportionate amount of alcoholism and drug abuse within our Native American veterans because they're trying to escape still, decades after the Vietnam War. American Indian veterans reported the poorest physical health and the highest level of medical care use in the original study. Obviously, this is due to the chronic alcohol and drug problems, but part of it is due to the culture, because they grew up being a warrior. You're not allowed to say, I hurt. You're not allowed to say, I need help. And because of that, we miss the opportunity to intervene early. In closing, the good news is, as we look at our Native American brothers and sisters and the fact that they have served this nation from the very beginning of this nation nearly 250 years ago, before they were citizens, they stepped up and they did what was right to help a growing nation. And decades later, centuries later, they still volunteered in disproportionate amounts. They've always served with dignity, professionalism, and when they return home, even with problems, they are the most humble people that never take credit for anything that they did for this great country. So we owe it to our brothers and sisters who have served to make sure that they are recognized and thanked every day for the sacrifices they have made and the continued sacrifices they make. Thank you very much.